Hey there, Tuan here. I'm a day 1 Genshin Impact player, currently at AR 59. Welcome to the complete Kamisato Ayaka guide. I've been using Ayaka for over 8 months now, so I'm really excited to make this video to share with you guys my understanding of Ayaka. We're going to have a look at Ayaka's kit, weapons, artifacts, and team comps. At the end of the video, I will put my Ayaka showcase as well as give my closing thoughts. Just like and subscribe to my channel if you find this video helpful. Alright, let's go. To begin with, let's start with analyzing Ayaka's kit. I will go over her talents, talent priority, playstyles, ultimate combos, and constellations. For combat talent, the first combat talent that we have is normal attack, Kamisato Art Kabuki. With normal attack, she can perform 5 strikes, with her 4th strike that can deal 3 hits, while the rest of the strikes deal 1 hit. Her charge attack is a bit complex. When you perform this attack, basically, Ayaka will pause for a bit to lock onto the enemies, then deals 3 AoE slashes. This consumes Ayaka's stamina, and enemies that are targeted will be hit. The second talent is elemental skill, Kamisato Art Hyouka. Ayaka summons Bloom Eyes that deals AoE cryo damage. Pretty easy to understand talent. The third talent is Kamisato Art Senho. When Ayaka sprint, she consumes stamina and becomes a fog on the ground. This has a greater speed than the normal sprint, and it can help Ayaka run over water. When Ayaka reappears, she can apply cryo to opponents and infuse her attacks with cryo for 5 seconds. The fourth talent is elemental burst, Kamisato Art Soumetsu. When you perform this, Ayaka will summon a snowstorm that deals cryo damage. When it's over, it will explode and deals AoE cryo damage. This is a talent that deals the most amount of damage in her overall kit. As for Ayaka's passive talent, we have this quality of life one where she gives a 10% chance to double weapon essential materials when crafting. For Ascension 1 talent, it means that after Ayaka uses a skill, normal and charge attack deals 30% increased damage for 6 seconds. For Ascension 4 talent, whenever Ayaka hits the opponent when you exit her dust, she will restore 10 stamina and gain 18% cryo damage bonus for 10 seconds. This helps a lot with Ayaka's stamina consumption in real combat. Alright, now that you have understood her talents, let's move on to her talent priority. Looking at her combat talents and multipliers, you should prioritize elemental burst first, then normal attack, and then edible skill. Next, let's go over her playstyles and optimal combos. Since Ayaka's main source of damage is her burst, what you can do is to use your support to buff damage, and switch to Ayaka at the end to use a burst to deal massive damage. Then you can either stay with Ayaka to do normal charge attack, or switch to other team members to deal damage or start buffing again. As for optimal combos for charge attack, remember that her charge attack costs stamina, so you can just use it constantly. What I would recommend is to do 2 or 3 normal attacks, then do a charge attack. Then remember to dash to hit the opponent, so you can restore your stamina and reinfuse cryo. Finally, for Constellation, I only have Ayaka's at C0, so I will quickly go over this. Her C1 gives normal and charge attack a 50% chance to decrease the cooldown of her elemental skill by 0.3 seconds. In real combat, you can see this being reduced from 10 seconds, which is a normal skill cooldown, to around 6 to 7 seconds. Her C2 gives a burst to smaller snowstorm that deals 30% of the original storm's damage. Her C3 gives her 3 more levels for her burst. Her C4 lowers the opponent's defense by 30% for 6 seconds. Her C5 gives her 3 more levels for her skills. And her C6 gives her charge attack damage increased by nearly 300% every 10 seconds. Looking at her constellations, and based on my research, C4 is the best constellation, then C2 and C3. Threatening defense is still one rare effect in the game, and I can make full use of this to deal massive damage. For C2, one thing to note is that this has large hitboxes, so the smaller snowstorm might not hit the opponent. Alright, let's move on to Ayaka's weapon. I'll focus mainly on the 5-star and 4-star options, with a brief mention of the 3-star option. Generally, 5-star weapons are better than 4-star weapons, so except for some cases like when the 5-star weapon you have is a support weapon and want to run it on a DPS, you should usually consider running your 5-star weapon. Feel free to let me know in the comments which weapons you are wondering about, and I will be happy to answer them. For 5-star options, I recommend Mist Bitter Reforge and Primordial Jade Cutter. Mist Bitter Reforge, which is her signature weapon, is the best slot option. It has a high base attack, a crit damage, and Ayaka can gain all 3 stacks to increase her cryo damage bonus. One tip to gain full stack is to add a normal attack to your combo. For example, dash to the opponents, do 1 normal attack, then E, then Q. As for Jade Cutter, it has a high crit rate, and Ayaka can also utilize the full passive in all situations. You just need to keep in mind that if you are running artifact sets like Blizzard Trader, which I will go into more details about in the artifact section, can be over 100% crit rate. So you can focus on other stats like crit damage, attack or ER when you run this weapon. For 4-star options, I recommend Amenuma Kabuki, Blackleaf Longsword, and the Black Sword. The first 2 swords are free-to-play weapons, and you can get the Black Sword from the Battle Pass. They all have good substats that can help Ayaka. I recommend Kabuki since Ayaka can utilize her passive to help her gain her burst back. and the design looks sick on her. If you have the chance to refine this weapon, go for it. Black Clip Longsword is also a good weapon with its crit damage substat. The passive is a bit niche and it requires you to defeat opponents to gain stack. The Black Sword gives a reasonable crit rate for you to not overcrit. But if you are not an active Battle Pass user, I recommend not getting this weapon specifically for Ayaka, since the first two options are sufficient and there are better weapons in the Battle Pass like the Serpent Spine that you may want to have a copy of refinements on. For 3-star option, you can run Harbinger of Dawn. This is a good beginner option as you can utilize his crit damage substat and extra crit from passive. You can use this until you get a 4-star option like Kabuki or Blackcliff. Okay, let's move on to how you can build artifacts for Ayaka. The nice thing about building Ayaka's artifacts is that she has a best-in-slot artifact set, which is a 4-piece Business set. It gives you a 15% cryo damage bonus with 2-piece effects. 30% crit rate when you hit the opponent affected by cryo, and 40% crit rate when the opponent is frozen with its 4-piece. Combining with the cryo resonance that gives you a 50% crit rate, you already have a 55% crit rate running this set alongside another cryo character in your team. This set helps you build Ayaka easier, as now you'll need a bit of crit rate substats. Then you can focus on building other stats like crit damage, attack percentage, or ER percentage. Another set that may work well is a full 4-piece Emblem Silver Fate set. Not only will it give you 20% ER with a 2-piece effect, but it will also give you an increase in burst damage. For example, if you have 120% ER, then you will gain a 30% burst damage bonus. This set is great, but not as good as Business Trader, since you still need to build a lot of crits. Ayaka is a DPS, so you also don't need a lot of ER, which means the 4-piece effect is less effective. Also, an alternative is to use 2-piece Business Trader and 2-piece 18% attack or 2-piece Noblesse Oblige. If you use a weapon that gives you crit rate like Jade Cutter, then this can be a good option because with Business Trader, Ayaka will likely be over 100% crit rate. Also, in the case when the enemies can be frozen, like Perpetual Mechanical Array, or you want to run a melt team, this alternative is more suitable than the 4-piece Business Trader set. As for artifact stat, for Sense, you should run attack percentage, cryo damage on Goblet, and crit damage or attack percentage on Circlet. One thing to note for Circlet is that since you can have a lot of crit damage when using Business Trader, it may be better to run an attack percent Circlet, especially a good piece with great substats. But generally, crit damage Circlet is what I would recommend here. For substat, you should focus on crit damage, attack percentage, ER percentage, and crit rate percentage if you don't have enough crit. I want to focus more on energy charge here. Ayaka's E generates 4.5 particles with a 10-second cooldown, which is quite a lot. But she is still an energy-hungry character, as her burst requires 80 energy. So besides having your cryo support for no energy for you, you should still have Ayaka at high ER like around 120 to 150% ER to get burst up or cooldown. Mine is currently at 121, but I can manage energy quite well, so it's working okay. But if I have the chance to get more artifact species with more ER stats and similar crit or attack stats, I'll definitely go for a higher ER. Alright, moving on to team comp, which is the most important part. You already understood how to build Ayaka, so you need to understand the enemies Ayaka will face and the suitable teammates so you can maximize Ayaka's potential output. There are 3 main teams that you can use for Ayaka: Freeze Team, Mono Cryo Team, and Melt Team. Let's talk about some cases to understand the suitable scenario for each team. We know Ayaka is a cryo character who deals damage with her cryo burst. So the main thing you need to consider is, can the enemies be frozen? While they are frozen, Ayaka can fully activate the 4-piece Business Trader effect. You can also use animal characters to group them up and use Ayaka's burst to deal full damage. This burst will stay still when it hits at a frozen opponent. So Freeze Team can work quite well in this case when the enemies can be frozen. Although there are other enemies that can be frozen, for example Perpetual Mechanical Array, then it's not essential to bring Hydro to freeze, and you can consider using other teams like Mono Cryo Team or Melt Team. Let's talk about Freeze Team first. For 5-star and 4-star options, I recommend Ayaka, Senho, Kokumi, and Kazuha. We have Kokumi who has a good uptime for Hydro application. She can provide lots of attack buff with Turing Tales Book and Tenacity artifacts, as well as providing very comfortable healing. We also have Senho who can generate particles to help Ayaka get her burst back, and also buff Ayaka's damage. Finally, Kazuha can help lower the elemental resistance with the VV set. He can also group the enemies, and most importantly, provide an elemental damage bonus to further increase Ayaka's damage. Let's see this in actual combat. I currently don't have Kazuha, so I will use Sucrose here. Here is an example rotation with all the bursts available. First, you use Senho's E, Q to apply cryo and buff cryo damage. Then you use Kazuha or Sucrose E, Q to apply VV set effect and buffing. Then you switch to Kokumi to do E to apply Hydro to freeze the opponent. Then use Ayaka's E to generate energy, then Q to finish the enemy off. After this, it is flexible depending on the situation. You can go back to Senho to use E to generate energy for Ayaka's burst, or use Kokumi to refresh her jellyfish. When Ayaka's Q is ready, you can then repeat the rotation again. The goal is for Ayaka's Q to deal the highest damage to the opponents. I do believe this is one of the overall strongest teams in the game right now, as of 2.6. The teammates are flexible as you can also run Rosaria or Ganyu instead of Senho, Mona instead of Kokumi, or Venti instead of Kazuha. For example, Ayaka, Ganyu, Venti, and Mona is a great team that can deal high AoE damage. Or you can also use the Kamisato sibling team with Ayaka, Ayato, Ganyu, and Venti. It's all about quadratic scaling, you know. For all 4-star options, you can run Ayaka with Diana, Senho, and Sucrose. Diana is a great healer, shielder, and a battery who can run full Noblesse Oblige, which helps buff attack to Ayaka. Senho can apply good hydro application, provided that Ayaka deals normal attack to opponents, and Sucrose can help lower ability resistance and provide grouping. Then we have Mono Cryo Team, where the main core is all Cryo or Cryo plus Animal. You can pretty much use the recommended freeze team above and replace Kokumi with Ganyu, Rosaria, or Diana. For example, Ayaka, Senho, Diana, and Kazuha would be a good team. This would lower the ER requirement on Ayaka, since we have more Cryo characters, but since you can freeze the opponents, you might need to run more crit here on Ayaka. You still use a Blister set. The rotation for this team will be similar to the freeze team. Always make sure that when you use E on another character other than Ayaka, try to switch back to Ayaka to get all the particles so she can get burst quickly. For all 4-star options, you can run Ayaka, Diana, Rosaria, and Sucrose. Finally, we have Melt Team. The main reaction is Cryo plus Pyro. This is an interesting for sure. Team recommend is Ayaka, Diana, Bennett, and Shelling. The team is a single target focused team that utilizes Ayaka and Shelling's insane burst damage. One thing that you need to understand is that Ayaka's burst has a default internal cooldown, which means she can proc melt reliably. So sometimes you will see Xiangling triggers reverse melt, sometimes Ayaka will be the one to trigger forward melt. In actual combat, suppose that all your buffs are up. First you use Diana E, Q to generate a shield and create a healing field. Then you use Bennett Q, E to deal good melt damage. Then quickly switch to Xiangling to get the particles from Bennett's E. Next, use Xiangling EQ to perform Pyronado. And finally, using Ayaka's EQ to summon a Snowstorm. You can see the nice melt damage here triggered by Ayaka and Xiangling's burst. If you run this team, a quick tip is that this team needs high ER, since you need Ayaka and Xiangling burst to be available as soon as possible. This is also a nice all 4-star option you can use. For alternative members, you can switch Diana out for Senho or Rosaria to provide more damage. Remember that Blizzard Trio will not work for Ayaka, since there's no cryo most of the time, so running the alternative set is preferable here. You can also use an animal character in the cryo slot to provide more grouping and buffing, but there could be no one to generate particles for Ayaka, so you need to run more ER on Ayaka. Alright, before we move to the showcase, the sections above are mainly for Ayaka as a DPS. If you're considering using Ayaka as a sub DPS, her E generates quite a lot of particles with a low cooldown, so she can be a battery for other cryo DPS. You can use a weapon like Favonius Sword or Sacrifice Sword on her. Her burst, even with sub DPS build, can still dish out decent damage and has a high cryo application. So for the perfect build, you can prioritize ER so she can get burst back quickly. For example, you can use Ayaka and Hyouka team. You can then fire up Ayaka's burst, then use Hyouka to do charge attack or burst to deal massive melt damage. Although I'm not using Ayaka as a sub DPS now, it's definitely still an interesting build to try out. That being said, let's move on to the showcase. I will show all 3 teams that I mentioned above. I have some text commentary so you would know the stats and what's running on. Let's go!
Open eye, feel the waves cut through me, hypnotized by the sounds I'm breathing in. Hold tight, chemicals collide. Hold tight, dripping lights paint the skies, all because of you. Dripping lights paint the skies, only you can make me move.
In conclusion, Kamisato Ayaka is one of the most insanely broken DPS characters in the game right now, as a version 2.6. She is one of my favorite characters and is my go-to choice when playing tougher content like the Spiral Beast, and I could see that I am still gonna use her even more in the future. Alright, I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions about Ayaka, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please subscribe if you find this video helpful. This is Tuan, signing out. Peace.